A warm good morning to each one of you connected to us today for the prestigious Singularities International Online Conference on Love in collaboration with Kerala State Higher Education Council and Department of Sociology and Teresian International St. Teresa's College Autonomous Ernakulam. Singularities, the peer-reviewed international transdisciplinary research journal, has been in publication since 2014, and 8 volumes have come out so far, exploring the contemporary and the contentious, cutting across academic disciplines and ideological bounds. The much-awaited SICON annual conference has started its onward journey with SICON Power 2016 with Professor Bill Ashcroft as its keynote speaker at Korambil Ahmad Haji Memorial, Unity Women's College, Manjeri. Ever since, it has attracted the attention of students, scholars, and academicians alike, which inspired SICON Space in 2017, SICON Beauty in 2018, SICON Truth in 2019, SICON Time 2020, SICON Liberty 2021, and now we are with SICON Love 2022. Team SICON has been brilliantly efficient in bringing in luminaries from far and wide under the guidance of Dr. P.K. Babu, the chief editor of Singularities. To name a few luminaries who have joined us during these years, Professor Bill Ashcroft, Professor Ronald Strickland, Mr. T.M. Krishna, Professor Jonathan Color, etc., and a whole lot of renowned speakers from India across various disciplines. Singularities Team SICON continues with its mission of keeping the platform alive for reinterpretations and recontextualizations to explore plurality that has come to rule the roost in the millennium. Let's invoke the blessings of the Almighty to grace the occasion. Miss Maria Senorita from St. Teresa's College, Miss Maria Senorita Rose from St. Teresa's College shall do that on behalf of this august assemblage.
Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of the life spent with you. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me.
Thank you, Miss Maria. When we heartily welcome each one of you to SICON International Online Conference on Love 2022 for the formal welcome note to this August assembly, let me call upon Miss Elizabeth Abraham, Head, Department of Sociology and Center of Research, St. Teresa's College, Autonomous Ernakulam. Ma'am, please.
Good morning. Unless it is either beautiful or practical, it can safely be classified as trivia. I resonate with this statement by Richard Rudd. I would also like to add that love is most beautiful and practical in its myriad forms. In today's modern and diverse environment, it is very important that we forget our differences and rediscover the magic of love. It is with great pleasure and privilege that I welcome you all to this 3-day international conference on love, organized by Singularities, the Transdisciplinary Biannual Research Journal, in collaboration with the Kerala State Higher Education Council, Teresian International, and the Department of Sociology and Center for Research, St. Teresa's College, Ernakulam. We have a number of prominent speakers from across disciplines and domains who will explore the several complex interconnected themes on love. Also, we have 8 paper presentation sessions across 3 days, during which several delegates from various disciplines will present their academic reflections on love. Now, coming to my duty, I would like to place on record our sincere appreciation for the support and assistance rendered by the Kerala State Higher Education Council in making this conference a reality. Today, we are honored to have Professor Sundar Sarukkai as our chief guest and the keynote speaker. He's the founder of the Barefoot Philosophers Initiative. On behalf of Kerala State Higher Education Council, Singularities and St. Teresa's College Autonomous Ernakulam, I welcome to you to this August gathering. I welcome Dr. Sister Vinita, Manager and Provincial Superior of CSSC institutions in her absence, who constantly motivates us to strive for excellence. Dr. Lizzie Matthew, our principal, is the beacon of light and the source of invaluable support and guidance in all our endeavors. I wholeheartedly welcome her to this inaugural session. Dr. P.K. Babu is the conference chair, chief editor of Singularities, a peer-reviewed transdisciplinary biannual research journal, without whom this conference would not have been possible. He's an eminent scholar and an academician, and also the former principal of MES College, Mambad. Currently, he's the principal of Al Shifa College of Arts and Science. With utmost respect, I welcome you, sir, to this function. Dr. Priya K. Nair is a widely acclaimed author and faculty from St. Teresa's College, who is currently on deputation to Higher Education Council. It is my immense pleasure and honor to welcome you to this function. Reena CM is the academic coordinator and the editorial board member of Singularities. She is an assistant professor in English at KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri. I welcome you, ma'am, to this function. I welcome Ms. Ashwati MP, editorial board member and coordinator of Singularities Journal. Welcome, ma'am. I would also like to welcome the administrative coordinators, Dr. Jisha John, Ms. Sona Thomas, and Ms. Carolyn Lloyd, the technical assistant of this conference, who have meticulously planned the session. Welcome you all. I would like to specially mention all my colleagues and students from the Department of Sociology who will be coordinating all these sessions. Let me close by once again wholeheartedly welcoming all, including the special invitees, delegates, and participants to this conference. Wish you a delightful and intellectually stimulating experience. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am,
for that welcome note. Besides being a significant floor for intellectual deliberations and academic thought sharing, Singularities, the transdisciplinary biannual research journal, has been successful in collaborating with other institutions, enabling the joys and glories of this shared experience. Following up with its initial conferences at KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri, Dr. Ghafoor Memorial MES Mambad College and Farooq College Autonomous Farooq have been venues for the same. It's a pleasure to be associated with St. Teresa's College Autonomous Ernakulam for SICON Love 2022 and the Research Department of Sociology and the Teresian International, the international wing of St. Teresa's College, instrumental in facilitating exchange programs for staff and students. Let's have Dr. Lizzie Matthew, Principal of St. Teresa's College, for the Presidential Address of SICON Love 2022. Ma'am, please.
Invited dignitaries for the 3-day online international conference SICON Love 2022. Professor Sundar Sarukkai, Center for Society and Policy, Bangalore. Professor P.K. Babu, Chief Editor, Singularities Journal. Srimati Elizabeth Abraham, Head of the Sociology Department, and other faculty members of the department, Ms. Reena CM, Conference Coordinator, other invited guests, Dr. Jisha John, Faculty Coordinator of Teresian International, and the team Teresian International, and dear participants of various disciplines, warm good morning to all. Love, what so far we have understood, is a trust, the caring and the intimacy, ultimately for happiness and peace among people and people with the environment. It is the biggest word in the dictionary of mankind and the very basis of humankind. In Christianity, it is the unconditional bond of concern and passion of God for man and man for God. According to psychologists, it is an emotional feel of intimacy and commitment due to passion. But it varies and changes over time and conditions. The purest form of love is selflessness. And I don't think these days anybody can define this purest form of love, whether it be between man and woman or between people in the society or even in the family. In human relations, it is always misunderstood. And that is the reason for all the stress, friction, and frustration among the people, between friends, between man and wife, or vice versa, between parent and child, or the reverse. And the biggest problem is the possessiveness that humans define or find in love. That is, if you love a person, you are mine and mine only, that attitude. And at that point, when one realizes that this state of feeling love is lost, it leads to sadness, loneliness, depression, sometimes even making the person aggressive, irrespective of the age. In the present days, that natural essence of love, or the true texture of love, the pure and original love, better say the unconditional love, is a rare phenomenon. Today, love is always like giving and giving, accepting from one side, like an arrangement, always one-sided, with too much of expectation as to keep the other person or the other people always happy in every relation, for relations to go smooth. One person always sacrificing. And that is the main reason for all the violent feeling among the people in relations, irrespective of the age, whether it be the elderly, whether it be the children too. And at the end of the day, we have heard of remarks like, I got this because I blindly loved him or loved her or loved the person. And also we hear that no one actually deserves love and commitment. No one deserves sincerity. Instead of realizing that it should be maintained as a warm feeling without possessiveness and too much of expectations, it is like a condition in every relation. We should realize love is a feeling when we are willing to love others for who they are with unconditional affection. And the message of love in all our sacred scriptures is that love each other deeply, because love covers over the multitude of sins. This 3-day international webinar on love will define this requisite skill, but an endangered feeling for existence from different angles, from eminent people with different styles of thought. I hope and wish the participants will definitely get deep content on the real definition of love, and may you all be able to transact the message of love to others as ambassadors of love. When I got the brochure of this webinar, I too felt very strange. Love, what so much to talk about love? All 3 days to talk and hear. Very strange I felt. But in reality, it is a need of the present times, because in every relation, this love is becoming toxic, sometimes even leading to crimes and to a great extent, even suicides. Let us try to understand this emotion or this emotional feeling, love, in its true sense, and spread the message to the common man, the ignorant section, on what true love is and how it should be, or how it can be sustained for a harmonious life and successful coexistence. I truly appreciate the organizers of this 3-day international webinar, that is the Department of Sociology and the Teresian International, for selecting this topic. My appreciation I should specify to Srimati Elizabeth, HOD of the Sociology Department, and other faculty members of Sociology Department, Dr. Jisha John, the coordinator of Teresian International, Dr. Priya Nair, the research officer of Kerala State Higher Education Council, for guiding the Sociology Department, and Ms. Reena CM, the conference coordinator, for organizing this 3-day academic event. I sincerely acknowledge the support from Kerala State Higher Education Council and the team Singularities International for having collaborated with St. Teresa's College for a webinar of this kind. I could understand there are 7 sessions arranged with highly resourceful and eminent speakers to share the content of love from various domains. And definitely it will be a transdisciplinary approach. Wishing that the sessions all will be fruitful in its true sense. My best wishes. Also, hearty welcome and sincere thanks to all the speakers in the coming days as well as today, who will definitely enlighten the participants. Again, my warm welcome to all the participants, the faculty members and scholars who have joined from different departments, different institutions, from different parts of the world. Love you all with appreciation, and all the good wishes for a blessed and prosperous new year. Thank you all. Thank you.
Ma'am, Professor Sarukkai sir is here.
Then Singularities Conference on Power, SICON 2016, was conceptualized. We never imagined it was to become a landmark in the legacy of conferences in the state and across India. Dr. P.K. Babu, our head of the department at KAHM Unity Women's College, was rather teaching us to dream with that beginning. Professor Bill Ashcroft became a reality in all splendor and pride in the remote landscape of Malappuram district. Singularities and SICON series is the brainchild of a great visionary, an academician, our mentor, and a true educator, Dr. P.K. Babu, who can never retire, but retired as principal of MES College, Mambad. He strives to bring in the best for everyone, never compromising on quality, inspiring all to aim at the unknown. Let's tune in for the words of Dr. P.K. Babu, Chief Editor, Singularities Journal, for the editor's address and the journal release. Babu sir, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Vinita. We all have spoken about love today. Principal Lizzie ma'am has spoken about it. And when we started the journey of singularities with power, and now when we talk about love as a theme, a lot has happened in between. Singularities has been a pleasant exercise for all of us. We never felt the burden of doing something difficult, something which is prohibitively scholarly. It has been an excellent team effort from the beginning to now. And all the outputs we have made possible, all the scholars we have brought in, the conversations we were responsible for, the networking we have made with different institutions of eminence. All these speak volumes about the prime motive of the journal and the conference. Today, when we are on the first day of the 3-day international conference on love, we not only have to recall what we have achieved in the past, but we also have to tune in to the future. The reason why we have selected love was that, as Lizzie ma'am put it earlier, love was beginning to become a kind of endangered emotion. Love needed praise, as Alan Bagley stated in Praise of Love. We have to renegotiate love, and we have to give space to love, because love is a jihad. When we draw boundaries around, when we fix borders, when we set limits, the unconditionality of love about which Lizzie ma'am spoke about earlier, it surfaces. We need an emotion, we need a state of mind which will not be restricted by ideological, religious, the so-called national or jingoistic sentiments. We should be capable of traveling beyond that. We wanted Singularity's journal and SICON annual conferences to be a theater of ideas, in a sense, where we can bring in speakers from multiple diverse platforms, and they would negotiate and renegotiate, contextualize and recontextualize emotions. So from power through liberty or truth, time, space, beauty, and now to love, we are re-emphasizing the need for love as a jihad, not love jihad. This is what we are trying to do. There's an increasing need for love because there's an increasing threat of segregation, classification, fixing bounds. And this is something we cannot allow to happen in the emerging scenario. I'm grateful to Kerala State Higher Education Council, St. Teresa's College for partnering us. And I'm equally grateful to all the illustrious line of speakers we have, starting from Professor Sundar Sarukkai and ending in Dr. Kunyameth on the third day, with the like of Jayati Ghosh, Biswada Wilson, actors and media persons in between. The conversation will continue because the moment conversation breaks down, we would have often disruptive action taking its place. This is why love seems to trigger violence in certain quarters. Rather than that, we should be civilized enough so that conversation can take place. And SICON conferences are excellent platforms for that. And I'm sure that the hundreds of papers which would be presented and the 7 plenary sessions which would come, the master keynotes we have made possible, all would incrementally contribute to a civilized space where dialogue becomes possible. And I would also state that Singularities conferences would continue in the next year also. And it's my pleasure to announce that the theme for the 2022-23 conference would be Race. And 2023 version will be held on 10th, 11th, and 12th of January. With that, I would move to the release of the conference volume of Singularities journal. the onlineality, I don't know whether there's a word like that, the onlineality of the acts we do often make it so difficult for us to do things the way in which we would like to do it. I'm grateful to everyone, particularly Ashwati MP, the executive editor of Singularities, who have worked hard to make the journal a reality. And I would also like to thank Rina, the member of Singularities Journal, and Vinita, who is assisting us over here, and Elizabeth, Jisha, and everyone who have taken a lot of pains so that this would happen today. Thank you, everybody.
Coming up next as the chair for the introduction to the keynote speaker is our conference coordinator, Ms. Rina CM, who is the assistant professor in English at Kormil Ahmad Haji Memorial Unity Women's College, Manjeri. A pillar of strength and loyalty to any team, Ms. Rina is a person with immense interpersonal skills and an eye for detail, who brings in the best, going any extra mile to any team. Let's welcome Ms. Rina to introduce Professor Sundar Sarukkai for the inaugural keynote address to SICON Love 2022. Ms. Rina, please.
So, Sarukkai sir, Professor Babu sir, welcome. Good morning to all. It's indeed a great honor to have Professor Sundar Sarukkai, the great founder of the Barefoot Philosophers Initiative, with us today. A Bangalore-based philosopher who works primarily in the realm of philosophy of natural and social sciences. He is an accomplished author and co-chief editor of Springer Handbook of Logical Thought in India, and is also the series editor for the Science and Technology Studies series, Routledge, and an editorial advisory member of Leonardo as well as Marg. His major works include Translating the World, Science and Language, Philosophy of Symmetry, What is Science, and Indian Philosophy and Philosophy of Science, and J.R.D. Tata and the Ethics of Philosophy. His recent book, Philosophy for Children, is translated into several modern languages. Besides these, he has co-authored 2 books with Gopal Guru, which are the first one is The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on experience and theory. And the second one is Experience, Caste, and the Everyday Social. Professor Sarukkai rendered his service at the National Institute of Advanced Studies till 2019 and was also the founder director of Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, where he set up an innovative interdisciplinary postgraduate program. Conquered heights as a great teacher who modestly puts forward his teaching philosophy to enlighten people on how to read texts and how to compose them. A person who enjoys taking philosophy to different places and communities, and his major concern is focused on thinking and conducts workshops for children, all with the noble mission of bringing philosophy to the public domain. Currently, he is visiting faculty for Center for Society and Policies, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Without further ado, let's invite Professor Sarukkai for the inaugural keynote of SICON Love 2022.
Thank you.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Reena. It's been a great pleasure to be with all of you today. It was a pleasure to listen to Professor Babu and Principal Lizzie and the others of your team. Thank you for many persuasive discussions with you, Reena, which allowed me to get some idea of this talk and what I should be doing today. It's always a great pleasure to talk to the constituency in Kerala. We have many friends there. I visited Teresa once before with my colleague George. So it's lovely to be part of this event. Thank you so much for the invite. As we have already heard from Professor Lizzie and Professor Babu, there is an urgency to talking about love. And while there is also a problem in excessive sentimentalization of this urgency, it is also extremely important for us to recognize ways of talking about it and the difficulty in establishing a particular discourse and, more importantly, particular actions, social actions based on the idea of love. So while I hesitated a lot to enter into this discussion, given the complexity of the topic and the urgency of the political action of love, I still jumped ahead into this to not talk about how love has been understood by so many philosophers for whom it has been a very important theme, but to do what Reena suggested now, which is to think about love in a particular way, to learn to ask that connected to certain possible ways by which we can understand love in the context of social action. The first point I want to begin with is this. In what sense is love a philosophical category? Or in what sense is it even of philosophical interest? What would our starting point be? As I said, while there have been many philosophers who have reflected on what love is and have written extensively about what love is, I want to think through a particular process of trying to ask, why did they come to those particular conclusions? What was the way they thought about this problem? So that they come up with various ways of responding to it, including questions of selflessness, etc., that we heard about earlier. The first question, of course, to ask about what is it to philosophically talk about love is to start with a very basic question of definitions, because one of the important functions of philosophy, as you know, is to ask about what would something be like. So if you ask the question of what is love, and we are asking for definition, we're asking for clarification of what it means, how does it come about in the way we have understood it, what kind of a conceptual world does it inhabit, and so on. And related to this is often a very common question in philosophical reflection, which is a question about its what we could call as its ontological status. Is there, for example, questions of existence of this thing called love? What is it? What is it really like? What is it? Is there something specific? Is there a material dimension to love? Is there an object of love? And what is the nature of the subject who loves, the lover, for example, to talk about it in the context of personal love? Or in the same, the discussions on ontological status of love, you could ask about the questions of psychological states of love. Is love to be seen merely as a certain set of psychological states? Are they mental states of a particular kind? Or are they states which have particular kinds of physical correlates? Or, as some philosophies have it, is it a particular state of consciousness, moving away from mind and body into a different state of consciousness? Would that be a way in which we would understand this idea of love? Now, given this multiplicity in understanding, I'm going to talk about I'm going to argue for one particular way of understanding love, which is primarily in terms of a very peculiar ontology of love, which is what really interests me and which to me seems to be a driving force of not just of the ambiguity of what love is, not just of the kinds of effects it can have, as Professor Lizzie was telling us, But there's a peculiar ontology of absence, a peculiar nature of this kind of love, which in my view explains its various characteristics and its difficulty in transmission into social action. And this peculiar ontology is the ontology of absence that characterizes love. A notion of constant seeking, and along with its very important concomitant phase of loss. So this idea of a particular idea of absence associated with these characteristics of constant seeking, a lack of constant consummation, along with the notion of loss, which seems to characterize something very important about love. So there is another way of approaching this question, which is one of the very important ways of looking at one subset of philosophical analysis of love, is to do just a linguistic analysis of the word by asking what are its meanings, what are the synonyms. There are a large number of words which seem to stand for love, like affection, caring, etc. What is the difference between these synonyms and love? Does love capture something more than just caring and being affectionate, etc.? And what is the difficulty in finding its current meaning, its correct meanings, or what you would see as the meanings which actually capture the spirit of love? What does that difficulty say? What does that difficulty entail about the nature of love? Now, when I look at this conference and I looked at the program of this conference, many of these topics are already covered, and I'm sure all of you are going to be discussing these topics in much greater detail. But when I looked at to see an overall structure in the way in which many of these papers are being presented, ranging from love in literature and films, love, technology and liberty, love and religion and mythology, love and society, particularly with questions of caste and religion and gender. And there is also a section on philosophy and love, and on education and psychology, etc. In many of them, I find that many of these papers are representing love, or talking about various representations of love, discovering the way in which love is talked about or represented in texts, films, and so on. And whenever we have a particular phenomenon like this, then we would immediately ask the following questions. What is actually being represented? How is it that there is this concept called love which gets represented in particular ways? What are the mechanics of representation, which include the politics of representation, the aesthetics of representation, etc.? And in particular, where is this notion of whether there is a representation of the idea of love in a quote unquote correct sense? So what I want to do is to start very briefly with this particular point and try and see if we can move towards trying to formulate this particular idea of ontology of absence with respect to love. So let me start with the question: when people are talking about love, what are they talking about? What is its relation to the written word? So love as an experience is a particular kind of a domain. Love has particular forms of feeling, and that forms of feeling could be from the parent to the child. It could be between partners, adult partners. It could be between many other constituents. It could be between strangers. When you meet somebody on the road and you feel a sense of something, love in a very broad sense. I'm using the word. What is it that we are really talking about, and how does it get converted into the written word? Or in other words, how does it get articulated? Because sometimes when I get mail from people I don't know who will suddenly say with love, with affection, then it's a very different way of establishing a relationship between them. It is saying something, but what is it saying, and why would we use these terms in our communication with each other? The first problem with the question of love has always been the fact that it has a very large set of synonyms which describe it, including questions like affection, liking. There's always been a form of union. And this is a very interesting question, and in a sense, we'll talk about it in the end. The forming of the union is the fact that love seems to be a very specific process by which the idea you move from the I to the we. The formation of the we, the formation of a union seems to be catalyzed by this idea of love. And so there are many questions about what the question of we is, etc. We have discussed, Gopal Guru and myself have discussed a lot about this question of we in our new book on experience, caste, and everyday social, where we were looking at the question of how is a social formed? How do people come together? And that is a particular process of we. And for some of the modern philosophical approaches to love, there is this question of how do we make sense of this coming together in some sense, okay, through love, through various other kinds of activities. There are also other meanings associated with this term, many times, very often from Asian and African traditions, in contrast to a particular modernist European civilization. And these terms very often invoke meanings of love, invoke ideas such as sacrifice. Very importantly, the question of love of parent to children are often can also often be expressed or articulated in terms of notions of giving up, sacrifice, and so on. A very important trope, as many of you know better than me, in literature and films. It's also about notions of subsumation, subsuming oneself in a particular way. It has notions of protection, sharing, and so on. Now, when you look at this multiplicity of meaning of this word love, you might then ask the question, what is this thing called love really about then? Is it just about a set of emotions? Is it about particular kind of emotional states? Or is there something else? To broaden the particular approaches to love, one could look at philosophical traditions from contemporary Western philosophy to Indian philosophical terms, which is duplicated in many ways in African and Islamic philosophy and so on, which is the question about ideas of, is there a word, is that, why, let me put it this, transactional states between individuals, but it becomes a synonym for the very idea of humanity and humaneness. That it is a synonym which functions at a much broader level than in terms of personal transactions. And part of the problem, as we saw in our introductory speeches, was that the question of love being excessively loved, the kind of associations which happens with people in love, etc., are often become extremely transactional, extremely utilitarian in some sense. But when you look at the idea of love itself as capturing some, I'm using this word very qualificatively, the word is, in some sense, an essentialness of humanity or humaneness, then you actually understand not just the idea of love in a better manner, but also the idea of what it is to be an individual and what it is to be the social, and why the question of strangers and the other becomes essential to the idea of being human. And that's why, I'm so glad to hear Professor Babu listing out the reasons of why you are doing this particular conference on love this year, because that is the urgency of trying to refigure what the question of the meanings of love could be. In other words, other ways of looking at it through these philosophical reflections comes from looking at it as love, not as an object of love, not as being reduced to a particular kind of object on which you focus upon or on which it is in relationship to, not even as human qualities and emotions, etc., but as something defining not just what the human is, but also, as in many religious cultural traditions, you could also look at love as a method, as a way to reach something else. So love is not just about the ontological status of love is not about an object like, but it is a process like. In other words, love is a constant action. Love is a constant process. It's a constant way to reach something else. So much of the very interesting discussion on love and Bhakti tradition, for example, and I include the Bhakti tradition across different religions, including Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, etc. In that the Bhakti tradition invokes the question of love as a process, not just as some particular end. And that love as a process completely changes the way we try and understand the mechanics of love and the meaning of love. part of this, in one sense, is something which again we heard about earlier, is that one of the very important consequences of doing this is to see how love becomes an attempt to achieve a particular kind of unity and oneness. And to do that, not just in a very idealistic sense, it is by recognizing the incompleteness of oneself. So while we do recognize this constant call, the problem of being selfish and so on, and the constant call to be selfless, the question also is to recognize what is it about our idea of the self that causes an obstacle to removing these notions of selfishness and move towards selflessness. What is that conceptualization of the self that we have? And one of the important points that reflections on love often point us to is the fact that the self is potentially incomplete. Our access to the self is always incomplete, both as self, our understanding of ourselves, and as understanding of by the other. So given this as a larger background, let me rephrase the particular point which I want to make when I ask the question, why is the idea of love of any significance at all for us to talk about? Now, the point which I'm going to argue now in the next few minutes is that I will argue that the idea of love has an existential significance, and that for an odd reason. And a good way to talk about that reason is to share with you a song which is very, very short. I'm just going to play a minute of it. And I was thinking whether I should play it or not, but then I realized that, you know, a conference starting on love should have some music in it. You know, how could you just keep listening to me talking? So let me try and see if I can share this with you. I'll just play it for just 1 minute. Okay. You know, I'm sure we would love to listen to the song than listening to my talk. I would also be very happy to continue listening to it. I just played you this song, a very famous old pop hit, which people of my generation might remember. Many of you as young students may not. And, you know, like I often, many times in my philosophy classes, I begin by saying, I begin by quoting a great philosopher who is not, who many of you may not think as a great philosopher, but I often use his utterances in my class, and that's Spider-Man. Like Spider-Man, Leo Sayer was, one of his few hits, is a very famous song, as I said, of our generation, says something very prosaic about love. And it's not a great love poem in any sense of the word. But, you know, in this prosaicness of pop music, in the kitsch of the pop music, there's something very important about the nature of love that is being said. And I want to try and reflect a little bit on what he says about the nature of love in this song. So as you can see with the lyrics, the two lines which I want to use, I love you more than I can say, I miss you every single day, why must my life be filled with sorrow? And this looks like a typical teenage song crying about, oh, yeah, about my life, and the difficulty of, you know, being in love and engaging with love and so on. But let me start with this very important observation which he says in passing, love you more than I can say. And when I look at that sentence and I'm asking, why can't you say what you want to say about love? Or what is it about love that always escapes more than what I can ever say about it. And although the singer here is probably saying in his term that maybe I don't have the language to say for it, he's actually saying something far more important for us when we reflect on it, that the phrase love more than I can say is true. It could be true for two reasons. One, it could be true because language doesn't have the capacity to do it. It could be true because it is a nature of love that it cannot be encapsulated within language. And I think that idea that love, that what makes love very special and what makes it different from the many synonyms that you have of love is that it is always more than what can be said. And I would argue very briefly, of course, here that love constantly escapes the bounds of language. And in articulating love, there is always something that is missing, something that is unsaid. I think across, I mean, one might say without pushing this point too much, but just also to use it so as to make a particular point clear. I would say that when you say things like I care for somebody, I want to do this for somebody, etc., there is a stability to that meaning, something which can function across in our discourse in a much easier way than the stability to the word love. And part of the reason why love is always more than I can say is because love, and that is the nature of love which I'm talking about, not because it's not reflecting on the nature of language. Because the point I want to suggest to you here is that love is always unfulfilled. It can never be consummated. And that lack, that its potential to be unfulfilled, its potential to be never consummated is, to me, one of the most important aspects of what love is. That's what makes this question of love so difficult and so ambiguous in very different ways. And it is, this point is actually also very well captured in this song when the second line captures this point by saying the line about missing you every single day. So when he says, I love you more than I can say, I miss you every single day. And I'm not trying to read a very deep hermeneutical reading of Leo Sayer's song here, but I'm saying that those simple words actually capture a profound truth for me about love, which is that love is most powerfully experienced. So when I'm talking about the question of love here as a particular form of experience, love is most powerfully experienced through absence. Missing something is an extremely important aspect of discovering your experience of love. And love is, we know this in various ways. Love is discovered when most often when somebody misses another person. When love is being captured, I mean, if you want to take a very stereotypical example of, let's say, two individuals who are in love and they come together and so on, and they live their daily lives. And like, all love stories, there will be ups and downs and of living together and so on. But the moment that one person goes away, is away for some time, etc., then the notion of missing that other person evokes a particular experience of love, which is not present when the other person may be there with you. So in other words, when love is seemingly consummated, when the objects of love come together, are actually not states of love, are not experiences of love, but when there is a particular notion of absence which is present, then a particular experience of love is actually triggered. We write poetry when we miss the other. A large amount of poems, whether from teenage to adulthood, comes when people are trying to write love poems to each other, or poems which are trying to capture the spirit of missing. And great love stories are about missing the loved ones. Whether it's and it's not just about two individuals and romance, whether it's a mother's love for a child, writing a poem about a person who is no more, missing a person who is no more. The moment you recognize that these experiences of missing are present in you, that evokes this notion, that grounds this notion of love which one might have in each other. We know that, for example, there are many traditions of great stories and in theater, for example, about unrequited love being such an important theme. A love which comes through when couples are split apart and are forced to stay apart. There are some of the greatest epics, some of the most influential stories in every culture is been about a person where love arises in the recognition of the person who is not there, who is not within one's grasp, who is lost forever, and so on. And all these examples of how love has been articulated over time only points a very simple aspect about the nature of love, that love is essentially a quality of absence. And there are many absences in our lives. We are surrounded by absences in our lives. We miss some of them. We don't miss others. We miss, maybe we meet so many people and then we don't see them after some time. But what that means is that among these many absences, there are some we miss very intensely, some we live, we engage, interact, and go on. We might miss our country when you're abroad. You might miss a friend when you don't meet them, etc. But there are also many other absences which we don't even register. In fact, the world surrounding us is more a world of absence than of the present. And the point I want to make here is that when we think about these, then to me, love arises in those absences which we cannot let go. And this is part of the reason about the kinds of obsessions which love raises in individual transactional engagements. But it is true that in most cases, including, as I said, love for a country which arises in exiles writing about not staying in the country they are, or all these kinds of forced migrations, forced refugee status of various kinds. Love arises in those absences which we cannot let go. And in all these cases, what is so philosophically interesting is that the absences arise as if they are most real. That is, absences, and that's why this is a very important philosophical problem. There is a set of absences which seem to ground the idea of love and the nature of love. And these absences are seen to be most real, that they are not a figment of an imagination. You are experienced as if it is something very real. So, so one might conclude from this that to understand the nature of love, what we are asking is perhaps that we have to understand the nature of absence. But given all this multiplicity of what love is and how love functions within our own personal and social interactions, the difficulty in understanding the nature of love is actually because we have culturally, intellectually, we have a history of not understanding the nature of absence properly. And what does that mean? Now, the first point about absence is that absence is not positive. Positive in what do I mean by that? In contrast to, let's say, presence. I'm using these terms in a very loose manner, but I hope you know that there's a very large amount of philosophical thinking around this, and we don't have to call it philosophical thinking. You can critically reflect on absence and presence to understand what I mean. Now, what I mean by saying absence is not positive is that when, in terms of my perception, when I'm sitting, let's say, in my chair in front of my table, I can give you a list of what is in front of me. I can tell you there's a chair, a table, a water bottle, a phone, computer, etc. I can list the things which are present in me, the things which are present before me, or which appear to be present before me. But if you ask me to specify what is absent in front of me, there are many things that are absent in front of me. For example, none of you as individual beings are present before. All of you are absent before me, right? If in a talk I gave last week, there were, let's say, a different set of groups of people who are there in front of me. So those people are also absent today in front of me here. But today, when I'm talking about absent, I'm only talking about your group, this group of people who are absent in front of me. There are a million other things which are absent in front of me. Elephants are absent in front of me. Tigers are absent in front of me. There are no mango tree in front of me as I'm sitting in my room. So the problem with absence is that it is multiple. It is infinitely accessible. And therefore, in contrast to presence, which is located and which is localized in the few objects that I have. So all of my presence is describable in just a small list of, maybe 10 objects in front of me. And I feel that I have captured the presence by giving you the list of things in front of me. And this inherent suspicion, particularly in Western philosophical traditions about absence, comes from their inability to understand or negotiate with what is often being called as negative ontologies and negative theologies and so on. But basically, the question is about the nature of this particular notions of absence, which leads to multiplicities and unrealities. So philosophies that privilege presence in terms of, for example, knowledge, evidence, particular perceptual qualities, and so on, do have a problem in making sense of the reality of absence. Very, very specific idea, which somehow doesn't seem to capture a more fundamental idea of what love is. But in contrast, there are very many interesting philosophical traditions that argue for how the idea of absence itself, the very notion of absence, is real and not something which is imaginative or the unreal in any sense of the word term. For example, even a realist school like the Nyaya tradition in Indian philosophy, which is the logical tradition, talks about types of absences. They list 4 types of absences, and they talk about the reality of absences in the sense, and this argument is very important, and I think it's important for us to understand that while I may talk about the reality of things which are present in front of me, let's say like the table and the chair, the absence of all of you who are listening to this talk in the room where I'm speaking now is also to me as real as the chair and the table are real. As far as the specification of the real is concerned, as far as how these objects appear to me to be real, then your absence in this room to whom I'm talking now is in fact to me more real than the table and the chair which is in front of me. And this notions of the reality of absences, which is an extremely rich domain of philosophical reflection in many traditions in Indian thought, for example, and the Asian African traditions, also runs into questions, is reflected in a very different way in Western philosophy when you talk about reality of not of absences, but of entities like mathematical entities and so on. So it's actually a very vast and very interesting field to think about. One of the very important ways in which different traditions, for example, the Buddhist tradition understands, the term such as emptiness, and emptiness can be located in very different registers, including the question of emptiness as a great absence, where there's a complete absence of material objects, for example. And emptiness, as many of you may know, it becomes one of the foundational conceptual world that organizes reality in various Buddhist traditions, various Buddhist philosophical, what I would call as rational philosophical traditions of Buddhism. So, given that the idea of absence as real can be very important, and given that love is in some sense very deeply connected to the question of absence, one can then say that expressions of love in their complexity, in their incompleteness, in their, in a sense, a kind of an ineffability, are attempts to find language for absence for that which is missed. But because absence is not positive in our very positivistic imagination, it can also lead to invoking various kinds of absent objects to, to populate the absence with. And this is something extremely important. Let me give you a very quick example about 2 notions of absence, which comes with the examples of space and time. Now, even if you don't go into this domain called love and religion and God, etc., because remember that in many of the theological arguments and many of the Bhakti tradition arguments and many of the religious arguments of the love of God to humans and humans to God is also very closely related to the idea of absence, because absence is also very closely related to the idea of God, even for believers. And therefore, one might say that the presence of God itself is a particular type of absence. It's a very particular type of absence. Okay, and that is why the questions of surrender and giving oneself entirely into God, the dissolution of the self into that of God, becomes the greatest form of bhakti. For example, in the very influential Vaishnavite movements across India. So surrender of the self becomes a way to recover the absence. And so on. Okay, so even in the context of religion and God and theology, this plays such an important role. But moving away from these kinds of ambiguous categories of theology and love, and in terms of absence, let me look at two simple examples of absences. And these are the absences of two categories. I don't know how to call them secular. They are categories which you live with in your everyday life, which is not associated with any quote unquote metaphysical vagueness of any kind. And these are the categories of space and time. And what is so interesting about the concepts of space and time, which even children can engage with, can invoke and evoke and understand, is the fact that both space and time are fundamentally absences. And how do we engage with our absence? How do we engage with the absence of space and time? When you ask somebody, people might say we are surrounded by space, and you ask somebody, what is the space that we are surrounded by? It is basically absence. It is nothingness which is around us. And what is that? How do we deal with this question of the possibility of the absence of space? What we try and do is we try to fill these absences with positive things. So we make sense of the absence of space, the pure emptiness of space, by populating emptiness with objects in the room. For example, so I take the emptiness of this room and then I put up a table and a chair and I put this almirah, put a fridge, put a kitchen, whatever else that I keep doing. I keep putting objects to fill this space of absence with positive entities. So this is very closely related to the question of desire, by the way, and the point about many people saying that this idea of retail therapy, that I keep buying, I feel very happy when I keep buying things. And part of this buying things and accumulating of these things, other than the fact that it is a major capitalist enterprise which becomes part of the way we live our lives today, is also an existential mode in us when we do not know how to encounter the absence which is present in front of us. So we fill our empty space with objects. We do the same thing with time. To confront time as an absence and its emptiness needs great strength. It needs great strength. Many meditative techniques are about this confrontation of the idea of time, about staring at time in the face of its nothingness. But what do we do in our daily lives? We fill our time, we fill this absence with positive events. I do something now, I've done this at 10 o'clock, I've done this, 12 o'clock, I have another meeting, 4 o'clock, I'm going to go out somewhere, 6 o'clock, I'm going to go eat. We fill our time with positive events. We try and fill this emptiness with things which happen. So I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I'm just saying our responses to questions of absence are through these. And if love is an absence, we can understand how we engage with the question of love, like we engage with the question of space and time. Just like we try to fill this emptiness of space and time with materialities of objects and events, we try to fill love by being with a person, doing things, being transactional, engaging, converting, filling this large absent emptiness of love with things around us all the time. But since the true experience of love is only through absence, through losing everything, that every state of love is often in this constant paradox, this tension between the experience of love as coming through absence and missing, but the actions of love are being in terms of positive actions of doing something in the name of love, all the time, constantly. But in all this, there is an extremely important aspect of what love is, and this is the last point I'm going to make here about this. But and why this point comes back to what other people were saying earlier. And this is the point that, so let me conclude by saying, in a way, to put some of these points together, that love, the state of love, is actually a perpetual state of longing. Okay? And at least in English, it's not an accident that longing and belonging are suggestive of certain very important connection between this longing something and finally belonging to something else. The longing, the paradox of this question of love is that when love is a perpetual state of longing, but the longing persists even in the presence of the object of love. No love gets consummated when talking about personal love between individuals, for example. No love gets consummated just by the two individuals being together, because there's a constant longing which persists, which raises its head in different ways. There is no, a garden of heaven that we have reached once you have found your object of love and once you have come together in this object of love. And the reason for that is not because of the problem of individuals who don't know how to engage with other individuals, who can, as we also seen, great love also becomes very bitter hatred, in personal relationships many times. So it's not about, the point there is not about, to conclude that therefore love is a myth and once I get married and this is what's going to happen, etc. The point is also that there is something about the nature of this love, that the fact that it's a state of longing which never gets satiated. And for example, people who love buying things, and I'm using love again, a state of longing in terms of desire of buying things, will keep buying things. There is no point at which they are going to say, well, if I buy 10 objects, I'm going to be satisfied. I'm not going to buy anything more. Because it cannot. You may buy it for the love of things, but the nature of love, that state of longing which never gets satiated, is that it is never going to be enough. And therefore, the real point about all this is that there is, through these particular kind of deliberations and reflection, we can understand what, I'm going to use the word very, advisedly here, the term true love. Okay, but just as to make a point here. So one could say, therefore, in the sense that true love only arises when we are totally immersed in the state of longing, just like being immersed in the total space and time without wanting to fill it with physical objects and physical events. In the same way, the real experience of love arises and is sustained when you continue to remain in a state of longing and not try and resolve it by filling it with objects and people. You cannot keep running from one person to another in search of love, because that is not going to satiate it. The total immersion in the state of longing, that is total immersion in the state of absence. And there is a term for this state. And that is why leads to my final point about how we understand the nature of love. And there is a particular name for this particular state, which is that it is nothing more than the dissolution of the self, since it is a self that drives longingness. And this constant point, which arises in so many descriptions of love, from literature, from films, from philosophy, and from day-to-day life, and from religious experiences. The point which is also made earlier today in the introduction about a notion of the dissolution of the self. What does it mean to say that the self is has to be dissolved into something else? And what this actually means is that this engagement with the self, with the primacy of the self, as we understand in our modernistic era, it is this engagement, this dissolution of the primacy of the self is the first step towards the love of others. What this actually also means is that losing oneself in the other is the true experience of love, because it allows you to understand and be in a true state of love as absence. And the love of the social, of the other, which as we saw is one of the primary definitions of love as humanity, the love of the social and the other arises only through this presence of the losing of oneself. Now, the question here is, what does it actually mean to say these kinds of things in an era which has an excessive focus on individualism? Or whether there is a particular kind of a very abstract, mystical way of understanding the self. It's not at all of that order. When you talk about the notion of love, then what this idea of love as dissolution of the other seems to suggest is very simple. In this sense, love is essentially a social reality. It is not something which is a product of the individual. The fact of love as a social reality, that love is a social thing, a social being, a social entity, which is often missed because we tend to look at love as if it is something which happens to individuals, that one person falls in love with another. But actually, even in the most banal cases of people falling in love with each other, in this case of individuals, very often they are expressions of socialities of various kinds. There are very clear types of people with whom you will fall in love, whatever that means, right? And there are very clear social indicators which will allow you to figure that out in terms of, even when people go outside their community preferences and fall in love, you can still see this as very social processes with various influences of the social present in this individual expression of love. Now, if we move away from this notion of, idea of this love as being excessively individualistic and see it essentially as a form of social reality, then the primary task in front of us is to recover this, recapture this sociality of love away from the excessive focus on individualism. The moment you recapture the sociality of love, even if you do not move into the traditions of dissolution of the self and the other, etc., you already have the imagination of a society which is based on some notion of love and not based on individual transactional problems related to love. So in this sense, I would say that the great absence which really characterizes love is also about our non-recognition of love, both as a domain of absence and as the fact that we have removed the love. What we have actually removed from love is this absence of the social in each of us when we look at love, when we reduce love to very specific individual transactions. And until we recover that, there is very little chance of us producing a society which functions on certain fundamental moral principles of loving each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for that deliberation on love. That was Professor talking about the philosophy of love, the sublime and the evil, where he has started off with the existential significance of love, the incompleteness of the self without it, how language is crippled when it comes to expression of love, its potential to be unfulfilled, which renders its ambiguity, the experience of love in absence, the philosophy of absence being real and positive, and a whole lot of other dimensions, including the surrender of the self to recover the absence, and love as a perpetual state of longing. It has made us understand what is the total immersion and love as the social reality. And he has winded up with the need for a society which truly understands the positive manifestations of love. I think we can go in for a short interaction. Miss Reena will be the moderator for the interactive session. So shall we go ahead, sir?
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Babu sir has asked whether the song which you played, excuse me, am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
It is whether it is More Than I Can Say by Leo Sayer.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, audience participants, if you have questions, please post it here in the Q&A.
Yeah, I see one question. Should I respond to that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Bibian says, can you comment on the statement that most people make, I don't love that person anymore, to a person who was loved once and is not anymore? Yeah, that's exactly the point I was talking about. The point is that, in the way we respond, we use the word love, we reduce it to, we reduce this notions of, we want to get away from questions of longing by discovering objects in which we can place this love, right? So you fall in love with some person, or you use the word that you fall in love with one person. But to be in love with if anybody thinks being in love with a person is to possess that person, okay? So is it not audible? So let me say it again. If you think that being in love with a person is to possess that person, possess that in many sense of the word, okay? Possess them physically, mentally, culturally, etc. Then that is, I'm not saying that's not going to be love, etc. All I'm saying is that that's not going to resolve the question of love, because it is the nature of love that it thrives on this feeling of missing and feeling of absence which is present in it. So when people say that I loved you once and I don't love you anymore, which is a very, we do know that in societies and with relationships, especially bad relationships, it's very common now. But the point about that is that what they mean by love when they use the word love, and that's why I talked about the question of how is love represented, right? And I began this talk. You read about love in stories, in poems, and in films, and I'm sure like many of you want to talk in the conference, you want to take them out and discuss them and so on. And in many of them, you are either going to discover the activity of love in the stories and the films, or you're going to go with what is being declared as love. So I would say, in that sense, I would say that, love is never declarable in that sense very easily. Love has to be inferred. So for example, a person who tells somebody in their teenage years, I'm in love with you, and might mean something, but just that the use of the word love does not imply that there is a feeling of that idea of love present in them. And that's what I mean by saying when love has been constructed socially, and this is a very important question we need to engage with. Love has, in the way we understand in today's life, has been constructed socially. It's been produced materially. I remember, as people have pointed out, when these cards, in the US, these Archie cards and Hallmark cards, when it came, they were actually a huge consumerist movement to make money out of this idea of love, which then becomes, Valentine's Day, etc., etc. There is a whole set of rituals associated with this, which becomes a major consumerist movement towards, in quote unquote, as some economists would say, to making money out of love. So in other words, what happens there is we are given the word love as a term to use in particular ways. I don't know what it means, but I know how to use it in particular contexts. So on Valentine's Day, you'll have hundreds of college students telling each other, oh, I'm in love with you. with absolutely very little understanding of the meaning of the word love, because 2 years later, they're saying that to somebody else, saying, I'm in love with you. Or they would say, I hate you after 2 years to somebody else. So the point, very, very interestingly, is that just because one invokes the word love does not mean that they have accessed the word or they're really talking about the thing called love. So that is the reason why I think in a lot of sense that it becomes, this conversion of saying I love you to somebody and saying I hate you after a few years is not actually a problem of the concept of love, but it's about the fact that it's a misuse of the term in that particular context. Okay.
Yes, sir. And thank you, sir. There's another question here from Krishna Priya.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's in the comment box.
Yeah, I saw that. In
an age of intolerance.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Selfishness, can love emerge as a panacea to the chaotic world? Again, I think I want to go back to this question is, yes, there is an age of intolerance and selfishness, but why did that age of intolerance and selfishness come? And has there ever been an age without intolerance in some sense? Even though there may be ages without selfishness as much as it is today, where you do have very individualistic monads which drive society. And in my own work and concerns on digital technology, we find that there is an increasing trend of monadism, individualism of various kinds which happen. I mean, today after smartphones and Netflix and whatever, all these things on your laptops, we don't even have to meet people. I'm seeing children in schools who are stopped talking to their friends. They are, everybody is just watching something reading a novel on the Kindle or watching their phones. It's constant. I'm traveling in trains where everybody around me is looking at a smartphone. And I'm so bothered by it that I don't have a smartphone. I refuse to use a smartphone, but still we are all caught in it in various ways. What I'm trying to say is everybody, the world has become so changed in the way these technologies have modified our ways of behavior. And one of the greatest forms by which capitalism can function, can develop in the way it wants to develop, is by producing individuals out of us. Once each of us become consumers, independent, autonomous consumers, then you don't have to worry about anything else. I mean, that you're going to make enough profit, whatever happens. So therefore, the question, why I'm saying this is, to answer your question, we have to ask, where does this question of selfishness and intolerance come from? Before I can understand whether, what is the definition of love which can address this question? Now, in our everyday lives, in the political world, question of intolerance is very different from the social world questions of intolerance, and the questions of intolerance within families, within communities, and within institutions, including educational institutions or or where we work and so on. So there are very different levels of intolerances working in all these kinds of domains, and in many of them, there is a particular notion of love which functions very well. For example, within families, which is an operative principle, a very important principle, even in the construction of the Indian, so many different Indian socials, that's very unique to the Indian social realities, is that, when you have a situation where parents are able to dissolve their self, what does it mean? It means to put aside their immediate needs for somebody else. Let's say their children. You already have one particular model, and this is a very difficult model. There are always plus and minus with these things, and I'm sure that many of you from social science know the complexities of this, but I'm just pointing this out to say that there are this notion of recognizing that my self-interests are not going to matter in a group network is already functional within families, within communities. So why does it not extend into the larger society? It does not extend to the larger society because of the fundamental, political structures, which is very closely linked with commerce and consumerism, and that's a very major problem, but which then gets converted into a large amount of intolerance and so on. So a quick answer to you is that just like the individual self has to be distributed, has to be the importance of the individual, the importance of the parent, somewhere the father and mother have to say, look, my needs are not as important as the children, right, at some time. In the same way, social selves, that is the selves of communities, selves of caste and religion and gender within Indian context, have to say, we are not as important, our needs are not as important as the others. Okay, without, I mean, be very careful about extending the family parallel here, okay? But the extension is just at the level of saying there is an operational principle of saying what it means to be selfless, okay? And therefore, love as understood as this dissolution of the self is a very important way of understanding how we can, make sense of some kind of intolerance in countries, particularly in India right now, and how we are going to engage with that question.
Thank you, sir. So there's another question from Mary Soni. The question is, can someone really love somebody unconditionally? Can someone really love somebody unconditionally?
I don't know. I mean, I think I would say definitely yes. And what this means is this. Okay, let me also put it this way. As I said, we have to understand love not in the context of traditional women, for example, who say, I love my husband unconditionally and will do whatever it means to satisfy their husband. But there are very many problems in that, because it leads to, in some cases, to abuse, in some cases, to total loss of a positive self of the woman and so on. So we know this problem. Many feminists have talked about this. So the question of loving unconditionally, if it is seen as an individual process alone, it is, I think, a little more difficult. But it is possible, like it happens, as I say, as I've seen with some parents and children, where they are able to give up on so much of what it would mean for them to be as individuals in order to do something for their children. And in that case, they may be shouting at their children. Sorry. They may be shouting at their children, etc., but that does not mean they don't love them. If we understand love in these particular ways of, doing unconditionally, I don't think that there are, but I think that cannot be sustained. Or let me put it this way: that it cannot be sustained if it becomes exploited. This notion of unconditional is exploited. In other words, if the condition of, I think many times people enter into states of love unconditionally, but it can only be sustained if the unconditional is reciprocated. And it's the reciprocity of that relation that is far more important for the unconditional. But in principle, the dissolution of the self unconditionally is absolutely possible. In fact, one of the most important consequences of the Bhakti movement, as I was saying, the Sri Vaishnavite movement, on this idea called Saranagati, which is absolute surrender, which is also very much present in Islam and Christianity. The notion of surrender to God is an unconditional giving oneself to God. There is another model which is of a very different kind in some of these religious traditions of a completely surrendering unconditionally to God. And that is an expression of love between the humans and God. So theologically too, that there are ways to understand this. The question is, can it come into the human domain? I would say it comes into the human domain if it is reciprocated. And that is perhaps a notion of love which actually sustains. Okay, Govind's announcement also been striving hard to arrive at a plausible definition and what feeling of love in our own mind is concerned. Love of facile candidate, Sarvam, Maya Jagat Vidya. So how do you resolve this almost nihilistic notion, the reality of interaction as a metaphysical experience? Wow, that's a long question, Govind.
Yeah, and Govind R is assistant professor of Newman College.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. No, what I've tried to tell you about, I think, Mithya is one possible way you can look at. I mean, those are not really about love for me. I would say that, and it's also not nihilistic. You could look at it that way, but there, as you know, there are many interesting counter arguments to the so-called nihilism of that. Now, I would say that this question of love really comes, I think, is most best expressed in the various bhakti traditions, including the Sufi traditions and the larger devotional traditions, which is about. It's not about the the illusory aspect of the world that is a problem, but it is about. Okay, let me extend your point. Maybe there is something interesting that you're saying. Okay, I'm just trying and see how I can. I think perhaps where I would extend your point is not to say about the illusory nature of the world, but about the illusory nature of the self. I think that's a very useful way to look at it. That is, in all these notions of, these notions of love in many Indian traditions, there is the point that perhaps the way we understand the nature of the individual self is illusory, and that you will have to find ways to break out of these illusions of thinking that you are an individual, you are the agent, you are the autonomous actor, and so on. So, I think one could do that, but we should also remember that there are also traditions, particularly from the poetic traditions, particularly the Kashmir Shaivism, and in response to Natya Shastra, the rasas in Natya Shastra, there are, where the questions of bliss gets added to the rasas of Natya Shastra, which is actually about a very deep state of love, where there's a total immersion of a particular kind. So there is, and that is a very ontological state, and that is, a state which one can aspire to as a state of existence. So perhaps one could look at Tantrism also as forms of looking at how love can be understood in different ways. So there are, I think, a variety of that questions you can look at. But I would still try and formulate the idea of love for me in my attempt to understand what is the love in the way we understand it in contemporary society or in our own everyday lives through these notions of absence that I tried to set out. Saki says, how do you look at love in connection with the caste hierarchies? Love is impossible in the age of honor killings. Yeah, I agree with you. As I said, the first point we have to recognize is we have to break this myth that love is about the individual and act as if it is completely divorced of a particular kind of social structuring that it already has. And therefore, that is manifested in honor killings. It's very ironic that many honor killings are directed towards couples who come together based on love. So love is the narrative which brings people of different castes together, for example. And then you have honor killings, which are supposed to, as a reaction to that particular thing. So it might seem, therefore, that love itself is a very profoundly difficult question. And I think you're right in another way. When I look at what's happening in the caste discourse in Tamil Nadu, for example, and it is in many places, as we know, like in UP and Haryana. But in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu, this has become such a big problem, as you know, the intercaste killings, intercaste marriages and the response to it. Okay. And if you look at how people are talking about these things, about honor killings, it's very interesting. There's a very important subtext to that. And the subtext is that, that love is not as important as the family. And the notions of love are actually discredited. It's saying there's nothing to do about this. All this thing is about fake things called love, and that we have to make sure that it's the family's honor which is being protected. And of course, the fact that it is addressed only to women, the girls in the houses, shows a very deeply patriarchal problem present in that society. But the only way to respond to this also is by, learning to talk about love away from a particular kind of this consumeristic enterprise it has become. It's only love as addressed in ways in which what Professor Babu was saying in the beginning, to recapture those kinds of ideas back in social practice that can give you a way to deal with this question. And I think you saw an example of that, actually. We have seen a very interesting example of that during partition. And of course, with Gandhi, there's a response to partition and the response on the fields of partition killings. And so we do know that is, for that you have to go back to reconceptualizing love and making love as a discourse in society, which is not reduced to the kind of love we have in society today. But remember that for our children today, the only point in which you have for love, what do you call? The only way in which children are learning about love to a very large extent is through these many regressive films in every language, whether it's in Hindi, Tamil, Kannada, etc. Maybe Malayalam is the only exception, since now Malayalam is producing such wonderful movies. But if you look at mainstream movies in other states, every third film in Tamil Nadu Tamil is called Kadal something, or in Kannada it'll be Prem, or all these kinds of extremely regressive ideas of love, which come through, which are propagated by the major stars and produced as big mega films. In Andhra, many of these places, including big Hindi films. So I think I would not say it's impossible in the age. I would say love is most needed in the age of honor killings. But to do that is to produce a narrative and discourse of love, which goes against this completely utilitarian way in which love has been understood and sold in our country today. Okay.
Sir, there are many questions that is coming up. I want to know about your time, sir.
Can I just summarize the few of them together? Or
yes, sir. Maya Mohanty has asked, can you please give a few suggestions about love to the people in their 20s? And there is another question, how media representations of love affect people?
Yeah, that I just responded in the context of, two major media representations, which is about films, where, definitely there's, and of course, TV, I don't even want to talk about TV and the regressive representations of love in those TV series. But we should also remember that many of them are driven by a very different kind of consumerist economy. I mean, you cannot divorce a larger consumerist economy from the way in which love is understood in society today. And it's not just about criticizing something about, buying cards and buying cakes or whatever, flowers and so on, but the whole ritualization of the commerce of love has really become so deep in people that the way in which love is performed in society, I mean, including in marriages. If you look at the way marriages are being performed and the kinds of things which are seen to be necessary for this exhibition of marriage, it's really shocking. And it shows how much of it has been reduced to particular notions of how one should show one's love. And that through the media, through the films, through our TV, etc., has played a major role in promoting and sustaining much of the hate discourse in India. So that's why I'm saying, and that's why I think a conference like this is so important, is it's so important is because what it tells me is that you need to change the way we talk about love in the everyday discourse, in how we bring in these ideas of love which are present. And it is not that they are not present. There are many wonderful, both political, literary, philosophical figures from different, figures all over early parts of India, right to including modern political movements in India, which have really been able to present this larger social nature of love. And once that is understood, I think, we can look at it in a different. In a way, it is also an answer to Manyata, because it says, the excessive reduction of love as if it is something unique to an individual, it is happening within an individual, etc., may not be the best way to go about it. Maybe one has to start beginning to recognize how the question of love itself is produced in very subtle ways, and how we respond to this, including questions of influence of what is meant by beautiful. I mean, this we know very well for a very long time. The notions of beauty, notions of desirability, all of which are produced in a social sense. And therefore, to think that out of all this social influence, suddenly an individual discovers his or her autonomous decision in falling in love, seems very misguided. And once we understand how we are socially constructed into falling in love and falling out of love, then I think it will give us a far more saner way of understanding love and relationship based on love with others in today's world. Because I know in today's world, there have been major questions on the nature of love and how we understand love and relationships, including whether it's about marriage or in the world of Tinders and relationships. They have massively challenged some of the basic preconceptions about love. So I would say, rather than, for the people in their 20s today, ways of conceptualizing yourself and notions of love. So, maybe that is the way to go about it. And maybe that's a good point to end our discussion on how you can go about this kind of a suspicious, critical, reflective, and open-ended way of thinking about what is love.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir, for your responses and your deliberations on that beautiful area. Shall we move on to a quick vote of thanks for the session by Dr. Jisha John? I hope we can move ahead. She is the Assistant Professor of the Department of English, and she is the Faculty Coordinator of the Teresian International. She's a very dynamic personality who handles the student-faculty exchange programs and works to materialize the institutional vision of promoting an intellectually rich and culturally diverse academic community. Dr. John, can we have you for the vote of thanks for this session, please?
The inaugural session has come to a close, and it is my proud privilege to propose the vote of thanks. At the outset, let me express my immense gratitude to our chief guest, Dr. Sundar Sarukkai, for gracing today's inaugural session and delivering the keynote address. Thank you, sir, for your extremely enriching and thought-provoking address on love and the thrust on the ontology of absence, the urgency of trying to reconfigure the notion of love. Thank you for inspiring us to think beyond the transactional notion of love and making us aware of the dissolution of the self to recapture the sociality of love. We are extremely privileged to have associated with the Kerala State Higher Education Council in organizing this conference, and I take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Priya Kenair and Dr. Shafiq V, research officers, for their invaluable guidance and support. Words are not enough to express my gratitude for the immense support and encouragement of our Provincial Superior and Manager, Reverend Dr. Sister Vinita, and our dynamic principal, Dr. Lissy Matthew. Thank you, dear sister and ma'am, in their absence. They are always there for us in all our endeavors. The Singularities Conference is undoubtedly the result of the vision and dedication of the conference chair, Dr. P.K. Babu, chief editor of the journal, which is a peer-reviewed transdisciplinary biannual research journal. Sir, it's your pioneering effort and commitment which has found culmination in this 3-day conference, and I sincerely convey my deepest gratitude for all the efforts taken. My immense gratitude to Ms. Reena CM and Ms. Ashwati MP from Unity College, and my dear colleagues, Ms. Sona Thomas, coordinator of Teresian International, and Ms. Elizabeth Abraham, head of the Department of Sociology, and all the dynamic faculty members and students of the Department of Sociology. I should specially mention the technical assistance rendered by Ms. Carolyn Lloyd and Mr. Jibbi, whose contributions are invaluable. As part of the organizing team, I should say that where we have come today is invariably the result of our amazing teamwork. No conference can be a success without the wholehearted presence of the participants. I thank all the delegates and paper presenters who have joined us from various parts of the country for your valuable presence. Wish you all a delightful and enriching experience all these days. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
That
you
was
all.
Dr. Jisha John. Now it's time for the paper presenters to move on to the presentation sessions. Your links have been mailed to you and posted in the groups. Before we move on, kindly fill in the feedback form posted in the chat box. And we propose to resume at 1:45 with the sessions by Professor Jayanti Ghosh and the human rights activist, Mr. Beswada Wilson. So for a time being, we move on to the paper presentations and we'll resume at 1:45. Thank you all
sir.
once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.